In the second semester of my sophomore year of college, I took a class called Sexual Medicine. Trust me, it's not what you're thinking. As the good pre-med I was at the time, I felt this course would help bolster my medical school application by allowing me to explore some of the social implications of medicine and the connections between medical practice and the patient experience. What I did not expect was that it would set me on a path to better understand myself and the way in which I move through the world. In one class, we were discussing the ways in which medicine has created arbitrary definitions of man and woman that exclude a host of genders and sexes that do not fit neatly into this binary. I did the readings and listened to the professor's lecture with a sense of confusion. What do you mean there's more than man and woman? That's all there is, right? It was in this class that I was first exposed to the existence of non-binary people. I read stories and accounts of genders that looked at labels like man and woman and found joy and solace in living outside of that binary. People who understood how the world expected them to be and had the courage and strength to say no. That's not who I am. For weeks after this lecture, I was scared. Not because non-binary people exist, but because I could see how the accounts I was reading correlated with my own experience. At 20 years old, I was starting to understand that the femininity that exists alongside my masculinity is not merely an expression of my queerness, but a larger and interconnected understanding of myself and my gender. Those first realizations felt much like removing a tie after a long and important interview. Relieving, freeing, true. And as it began to shed the social expectation for me to man up, I felt a new and truer version of myself come forward. This class would set me on a decade-long journey of rebirth to try on different words and labels to find what best fit me. I used different pronouns, moving from he and him to ze and them, to finally finding rightness in they and them. I felt the power of words on my tongue like non-binary and demigender, transgender and agender, before realizing that no single word could fully represent who I am. So other words began to come forward. My gender found home in sounds like power and quiet, in play, connection, laughter, and family. And ultimately, my gender found home in joy. Not merely the joy of being found, but the joy in discarding the expectation to find a single word to describe it for other people. My gender found home in me and me alone. This immense joy of gender would eventually bleed over into my professional passions and aspirations. I moved through different areas in higher education, from orientation and new student programs to multicultural affairs to my current work in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. J-E-D-I, Jedi. Trust me, the force is strong with us. My current work revolves around learning and development for faculty and staff interested in incorporating Jedi action and change into their work. This includes reflections on things within our individual control, like our attitudes and our interpersonal interactions, and things within our collective control, like institutional culture and standard operating procedures. One recurring training I offer is a trans ally workshop, where I work with individuals interested in building allyship for and with trans people. As a trans educator myself, I cannot deny that this work is deeply personal. I cannot deny that I will likely benefit from many of the things that I'm pushing for. And I cannot deny that I'm seeking my own liberation at the same time that I'm advocating for other trans people across campus. This means that the stakes are often much higher for me than for most who will go through my workshop. Because if they fail, They might come off as mean or insensitive. But if I fail my community. That pressure means I have worked through countless scenarios, talking points, and reactions to make the workshop as activating as possible. So here's $1 million question that gives me a lot of pause. How do you radically activate and motivate an entire group of people to show up for trans folks in the span of 2 hours? It's not a lot of time to get across information and practical advice in. Further compounding this is the fact that I'm usually working with people with a wide range of exposure and knowledge of trans people and trans needs. Some will come to my workshop who have years of advocacy and action under their belts, while others are just beginning their journeys in how to show up for trans people. Some will come to my workshop where I will be the first openly non-binary person they have ever met, while others will come who have trans family members, friends, significant others, and/or children. Some will come to my workshop who have a deep desire to do better, while others are there to fulfill a requirement or check a box for their annual review. When faced with these realities, I typically fall back into a pattern that will get me the biggest results the quickest. This can happen many ways, but often the most powerful way to impart Jedi knowledge is to tap into the emotions of people who are present. In working primarily with cisgender people, often the easiest way to build an emotional connection to this work is to talk about the ways in which systems can and do harm trans people. I discuss the mental, emotional, and physical tolls that transphobia takes, from disproportionate rates of anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation, to endemic rates of violence against trans people, to higher rates of and underemployment, especially for those living at the intersections of cissexism, racism, classism, and other forms of social oppression. These realities are important and necessary for those wishing to ally for trans people to know. But it also means that my workshop can be an extremely difficult place to navigate emotionally, both for participants and for myself as a trans person who has to impart the knowledge. So, if it's so emotionally difficult, why do I do it? And the answer is simple, because it gets results. Tapping into feelings of shame and sadness are unfortunately powerful motivators. Humans are hardwired to respond more strongly to something negative than to something positive. Because if we're wrong about something positive, we feel let down. If we're right about something positive, we feel happy. But if we're wrong about something negative, we feel relieved. And if we're right about something negative, we could potentially be harmed. Or, important in this case, we could do harm to others. Most who are coming to my workshop are looking for ways to reduce the harm in their behaviors. So showing them the pain that they could cause helps motivate them to make changes. But this centering of fear, shame, and sadness in my workshop is something I have never felt comfortable with. I mean, I found joy in my gender. Coming out and living as trans has brought me more happiness than trying and failing to live within the gender I was assigned at birth. And while in the past I've talked about that joy, my previous approach was never about imparting joy. But I also know that I cannot ignore the hard, shameful, and painful realities anti-trans attitudes, policies, and cultures take. I need people to walk away from my workshop understanding what many in my community go through on a daily basis. And this is where discussing fear is necessary, Because the fear of anything different, especially around something as policed as gender, is what has led to numerous state and federal policies we have seen in recent months attacking or outright banning trans-inclusive practices, whether in K-12 or college sports, sexual education, or in the private medical decisions between a parent and their child. Utilizing fear got me results, but I worried about the consequences to myself and other trans people in this approach. For me, fear manifested in my workshop in how I engage participants, and at times that fear was debilitating. What would happen if I was to talk about my joy of gender and people didn't see the importance of it? What happens if the reaction to my joy is that I'm written off as another overly sensitive Jedi snowflake who cares more about feelings than about results? What would happen if in centering joy, I failed and harmed my community? This is the part where I wish I could tell you I confronted that fear, leaned into my joy of gender, and intentionally changed the way I facilitate to recenter trans happiness. The truth is, I did it completely by accident. About 6 months ago, I was preparing for a trans ally workshop when I realized I needed a break about halfway through. I was looking through my PowerPoint and I decided to add a slide that asked a simple question. What do you love about your gender? Figured this would be a good break for me and give a little bit of lightheartedness to participants. But as I began to solicit responses, I quickly realized I had stumbled across something magical. The first time I asked this question, I had 2 women immediately talk about their joys in gender for completely opposite reasons. The first, a white woman, talked about motherhood and how her gender enabled her to feel connection and joy with her children. The other, an Asian woman, talked about how her journey in gender made her realize she doesn't want kids, and how by freeing herself from that pressure, she found fulfillment in her career and her extended family. I believe she used the term super aunt. In another workshop, when I asked the question, I had a colleague talk about music and how the songs and artistry of people like Whitney Houston and Chaka Khan enabled her to feel connection to and community with other Black women. Yet another person, a white demi-woman individual, talked about how utilizing they and she as pronouns allowed them to find home within and between non-binary and woman where her gender felt right. As I listened to each of these stories, I couldn't help but smile. I was awed by the way in which people found their joy in gender, and it helped me understand my colleagues a little bit more. I could physically see them come alive as they reflected on what about their gender made them happy. Something had shifted in the workshop with the addition of this simple question. As I've thought back on the responses I've heard, I've come to an annoyingly obvious realization to which I had been completely oblivious. Gender can be joyous for everyone. Joy is not the sole property of a single group. In working to combat transphobia on campus, I had forgotten that uplifting trans people is not a zero-sum game against cisgender people. In fact, I think the clearly opposite examples of joy that I have heard prove we can build our own joys of gender without attacking or diminishing that of others in the process. And to fully combat transphobia, binaryism, and gender policing, I think we need to build spaces where we can reconnect to and reclaim our joys. Since adding this question, I'd come to grips with the consequences of my fear around embracing joy in my space. by not trying to find the balance between the harsh realities that many trans people face with the joys that gender can bring, I was inevitably cementing a divide that exists between cis and trans people. And while the differences in our experiences are important and necessary to address to further liberation, I've also come to better embrace that there are commonalities between our different gendered experiences that can and do act as a starting point for collective action and change. So I leave you today with some simple questions. What do you love about your gender? What about your gender brings you joy? And how can you build spaces for other people to find their joy? The answers to these questions act as both a reminder for why we do this work and a call to action for us to continue to do it. And as we seek those answers together, we grow, connect, and love beyond what we thought was possible. For me, those possibilities mean I can stand here and say, my name is Matt. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs. My gender cannot and will not be contained by a single word or simple binary definition, theory, or label of who I am or how I should be. It enables me to build a growing, strengthening, and impassioned community dedicated to change. And that brings me unending joy. Thank you.